Life when you have a million tabs. There it is. There it is. All right, one watching. Click on that. And audio's muted. Good.
Is the W in brainwave capitalized? Oh, he's gone. All right, so let's get started. Oops. Two. Welcome to another episode of the Church AV Professional Advice Forum. I know it's a long name, so we just call it Church AV Pro. And here we talk about anything audiovisual that deals with our church setup. We got a couple of guests with us today, and we are really working on our technical parts, trying to make everything look good. So I'm going to show you my co-host here. Corel Holness is here with me today. And we have some guests coming in shortly. So I am, of course, your host, Robert Baker, and we welcome you. And I know that there's just a few of you currently on, but more will be coming soon. So remember to have your questions up. We are working on getting our streaming setup done so that if you do have questions for us, we can put them on screen and answer them. All right, so we just got a wonderful comment from Colin, and we will work on getting that in. Let's see. I'm going to go ahead and put that in. We're going to send it up. There you go. So we have a little bit of work to do on this, matching things up. We're working on Vmix, and this is the topic of our discussion today. But, and I was reminded about this last time, let's go ahead and pray. Dear Lord, we thank you for this opportunity to really talk about uplifting your work through the audiovisual ministry. We pray that you will continue to be with us and guide and keep us and be with our talk, our discussion today, that it will be useful to somebody. Amen.
Amen.
So, Corel, we're joined today by my brother, Andrew, who's looking around for something.
Let there be lights. That's what I'm looking around for.
Well, you know what? That's
Okay.
part of this setup. Andrew is not an AV person by nature. He is actually a an IT securities person. But one of the reasons we have him on today is our topic is software or hardware. We're talking about the juxtaposition between what's good, software or hardware. What's more important, software or hardware? Which do you like better, software or hardware? But one of the things, we've been in the AV world for a while, but I actually started out as a computer technician. I started out as desktop support many moons ago and went all the way up to systems engineering. And then, as I mentioned last time, that world melded into IT with AV because they're all the same. As you can see now, well, actually you can't see, but I'm surrounded by systems so that we can put on an AV production, but we're using IT. We're using computers, we're using networks, we're using cables, wireless. But there's always this issue between should you be completely software based or should you be hardware based? So I want to bring this panel in and ask them, what do you think? What is, I'm going to ask you, I'm going to start with you, Corel, because you've been doing audio for quite a while and you remember analog boards.
Yep.
So I want to go through and you tell me what's the benefit of an analog board? What's the downside of an analog board? What's the benefit of a digital board? What's the downside of a digital board? And then at the end of that, you tell me what you'd rather have.
Okay. Well, I think my answer to that last question is going to be a little tongue in cheek, but we'll get there. So you have many options, obviously. So you have your analog boards and you have your digital. The upside to the analog stuff is you get that analog warmth, is what they say, right? You also get all these patch cables that come along with them. and they can be rather fun. But the upside to the analog system is that you have a much easier time of tracing the wires, figuring out where things are plugged into, what went wrong, who ran over the cable with, the wheelchair and busted the cable up, and you're done, right? It's easy to figure that stuff out. In digital land with a lot of the consoles, that's a little bit harder, because once you patch your cables into whatever stage box or what you're using to get things into digital world, then you can pretty much route whatever you want. If you wanted to have the kick drum on all, 64 of your channels on the mixer, you could, right?
It would be crazy, but yes, you could.
Yes, it's kind of be insane, but you could do it because of the way digital is set up. Whereas analog is more so one-to-one. Whatever you plug in the channel, it's going to be on that strip, and make it very easy for you to follow the path of where it's going, depending on what knobs you turn on your auxes or what fader you have up and where that fader is assigned to then go. Right? It's very easy, very tactile to grab. The digital mixer also somewhat tactile, but routing is always the concern about how it's done, right? Where does signal come in, where does it go, and then where does it exit? And so signal flow is highly critical to audio in any way that you slice it, but ultimately the thing is that it can be a little bit hard to figure out how things are set up, or even which mix you're on. So yeah.
See, okay, so that is a very good point. So you're saying the benefits of digital is you have more routing options.
Mm-hmm.
Channel 1 can be organ, piano, microphone, whatever.
Mm-hmm.
But in an analog world, your mapping stays consistent, so you don't have to be surprised.
Yep.
So, and I'm switching back and forth between us. So tell me more about this analog. Tell me more about your experience when you first got into analog. Did you find it easy or hard?
Well, I'll say this. Probably 90% of audio is your signal routing and where it's going, right? The other 10% is how it sounds, right? That's kind of what I learned from school. And so the real thing is, okay, if you're trying to trace where a problem is, or you're trying to figure out how things are set up, then yeah, you're gonna I think find it a lot easier to work through an analog system to try to figure things out. Now, if you wanted to take that system and split it so that you had like a front of house mix and a broadcast mix or some other alternate way, that can make life very interesting. Or the outboard gear that you need to get it routed or hooked up to split is going to be expensive, right?
Right.
So that's the one thing about it. But in terms of cutting your teeth and learning and figuring out, well, this is what a gain knob is, and this is what a pan pot is, and this is what a aux fader is, this pre-post, right? These are all things that you can see and you can ask those questions. On digital board, not so easy to see directly.
I would say it's easier to teach someone new to audio and analog board. It's much easier.
Mm-hmm.
When my friend was teaching me, what he said was, don't be confused by all the channels. You learn one channel, you know them all, because they're all the same. They may have different instruments. You may have to tweak the sound a bit different. But once you know how to tweak it,
mm-hmm.
each one is the same.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas with the digital board, an Allen and Heath layout is so different than a Presonus layout, which is so different than a Behringer layout, that learning audio becomes more industry, it becomes more company specific.
Yeah.
So, and I know I'm hanging on you quite a bit, but I think one of the things, I want you to talk some more benefits about a digital board now.
Sure. So, there goes Colin.
Yeah, Colin's chair made an entrance.
Yep, there goes Alex.
Yeah, everybody just comes in all at once. This is great.
There goes the neighborhood. So I think the big thing with the digital system, right, that's important to, I think, for us to realize, right, is that the flexibility of how much you can kind of set things up and route things around and easily, I would say, even cascade things or make it bigger, right? Scale it up. You have a lot more options, right? And then it opens you up now even more so with what they're doing with networking and the way that you can pass audio over a network, which makes things incredibly fast, right? And so there's so much more flexibility. I mean, and then the other thing too is, right, on those digital desks, one of the things I love is these manufacturers understand that, hey, folks like to use certain analog pieces of gear. Now I'm just going to make it to where I can put emulations of these pieces of gear available to the engineers, and then they can utilize some of their stuff. Or if you're an engineer that is used to working in the studio, like much like I am, you know, manufacturers that make plugins and stuff will actually make their plugins available to the digital console manufacturers so that you can put them together and make everything work. So there's certain amount of flexibility that you get from the system, and then easily like being able to record stuff. So you're not having to physically patch stuff in. You just kind of pull things up on your DAW, and it'll route right there. So lots of options available to you in the digital realm, as long as you can wrap your mind around, you know, this is where it's coming in, this is where it's going, and then, you know, this is where my final destination is for whatever ecosystem you're using.
So now, as you can see, my camera has completely changed. So we're going to go to Colin as I fix my camera. And as soon as Colin came in with his chair, my video went out. So yeah, there you go. So now, Colin, you two have this long history with audio and going from analog to digital. What is your perspective on what's great about digital, what's bad about digital? And we're getting to the conversation about software versus hardware. We'll get to that in a second. But go ahead and tell me what your opinion is.
You just preempted me, because I think the whole thing is software versus hardware. We're not getting back to straight hardware mixers. That's, you know, other than your 4-channel Mackie or Behringer or whatever, that's, you know, those days are gone. But I really like digital audio consoles. I mean, the versatility, the fact that you could have a whole bunch of processing and effects, that you don't have to really wrap your mind around a whole bunch of cabling. It's light, you know, it's portable, easily installable. You can run everything over category cables. You can do massively extensive audio networks with them. They're fairly easy to configure. Those are all great things. But one thing I really don't like about digital audio consoles is that most of the people that, I shouldn't say most, many people that use them with, let's say, less than any degree of discipline. So what do I mean by that? There's good applications for them. There's bad applications for them. You know, there's a whole bunch you can do with them. And because you can, it's kind of like the fancy soft wipe transitions that you see in a lot of mixers and things that, you know, mix from one diagonal to the left, and you have 30,000 different ways to do a transition. Just because you can doesn't mean you should. And that and reliability. You know, what would be appropriate in a studio environment or for a DAW might not work that well live. You know, boot up times, recovery times, and interfacing with equipment, consumer equipment that was a general computing device that wasn't necessarily made or tailored for live sound can really trip you up when you least expect it. But in general, I mean, I love the technology, especially those that are based on FPGAs or some other type of firmware as opposed to a computer. But as I said, we're not going back, and I think the technology is just getting better and better every year.
Well, look at me. I'm in my own picture. So The question I have for you then is, Colin. Oh, no, wait, Alex is here. Let's go ahead and ask Alex.
Wonderful. Can you hear me?
Yeah,
Yes,
we can hear you
now.
just fine. And we're coming to you, Andrew. Don't worry. But so, Alex, when it comes to, did you cut your teeth on analog boards?
Yeah, my first mixer that I used for broadcast mix was a Mackie 32.8 analog mixer.
Oh, I'm sorry for you.
I mean, but the funny thing is, the funny thing about it is it goes to speak to what you can do with it, because a lot of people were saying, man, that mix sounds relatively. A fair number of people are saying, well, man, that sounds great for the people that can actually appreciate the difference. That's an asterisk. But, we were getting good results, and there's something to be said about being able to set it and forget it and have consistency. I mean, there's something to be said. There is a question of, what do you get with the analog sound when you kind of naturally saturate the electronics? Your response to certain signal level is different because of the analog nature of it. And you can manipulate that. If you know that your low frequency is going to give you a little boost at that low end before because of the way the transient is designed, because of the circuitry, because you're not doing it digitally, there's things and quirks like that you can manipulate. There are definitely things that would be good about an analog board. But moving to digital, we doubled our track count. So before, it was like, oh, there's a choir coming. Well, I have to unplug these 3 mics. Let me pull them out, put them over here, and then plug in the choir mics in the middle of the thing. And it's like, well, you better make sure you muted that channel before you unplugged it and you didn't have it gained up or whatever. So I cut my teeth on an analog board. But in terms of learning, yes, it is a lot easier. If you learn one channel, by and large, all the rest of them are copies. And you can't delete your scene on an analog mixer quite the same way you can with a digital one. And, moving tracks around is nice on a digital mixer. But if you do it wrong, I've done it. I was learning my first digital mixer, I was trying to move a track over and I just wiped out part of a bank and I had to go back. Treat it like a computer, save often and make sure you know what you're doing, because
there you go. You hit. You hit on it. So now let's talk about software versus hardware. Let's see a vote. I'm a hardware guy. I just say that right off the top. I'm a hardware guy. I deal with software, but I'd much rather have a hardware solution, says the guy who's actually working a software video mixer right now, but that's a whole different story.
So what do you mean by hardware though, Robert? I mean, what is actually hardware these days? Where does hardware start and software begin?
That's the good question. And you jumped way ahead of the conversation. Thank you very much.
I mean, that's where I was going. That's where I was going with it, because I think even a digital mixer, some would say, well, that's not a software-based solution because I'm not running the entire thing out of a computer. I could be running Pro Tools or Reaper or Reason or one of these DAWs with a USB style interface that gives me fader control. So that's my, the fader deck is my hardware solution, as opposed to a digital mixer that's like, a QL5 that's actually got a dedicated processor, has dedicated tools inside of that solution that you're paying for, that you get the reliability out of. Not to mention, you don't have to worry about upgrading your mixer quite in the same way as you would, something that runs on an operating system. Every time Apple chooses to upgrade it, are you going to lose your stability on your platform?
Okay, so for this poll and for the discussion, why don't we say hardware is anything that's not general computer based, so it's not based on a Mac or a PC?
Well, okay, now for that answer, let's bring in Andrew for that part. So give us a little bit of your background real quick.
Okay, so my background is network management, cybersecurity, IT operations, right? So I build all those networks you'll plug your weird devices into and create problems. But there's been a convergence now. I think that the discussion about hardware and software is hard. I think Colin made a good point. If you're going to divide it as general processing PC with a regular OS, then even then, even then, if you're running Linux on it, a lot of people are going to run a custom stripped down version of Linux on a general processor, and general processors are fast enough now that there's not as much overhead if you write a custom OS for it. So it's kind of an awkward thing, like firmware, right? So you take firewalls, which we've typically done, and switches, which are a ton of hardware, and they have some software that controls all of their, what you can do with the ports. I'll use, you guys are talking about mixers and stuff like that. Let's take a 24 port switch, right? A regular layer 2, layer 3 switch. Well, you got some firmware in there. Some of these guys have 8 megs of RAM or whatever, and they've got some software that they put on there, and that software allows them to put a totally different user interface, to control those ports in different ways, to trunk them, to have them individual, to make VLAN so you can't see different things going across them. It becomes really hard to say what's hardware and software. It really becomes an issue of how frequently does the software get updated, and is the software being updated by the vendor or by a third party, right? So if you're doing custom hardware and they're writing their own firmware for it, we don't tend to think of that as a software-based solution. It is software, but we don't tend to look at it that way. Whereas if they are, like our storage devices, they have a similar thing. There's a CPU. Sometimes it's kind of custom and sometimes it's kind of general, and it runs some sort of custom Linux, but sometimes they offer updates, and sometimes their updates are offered because, there was this vulnerability found in SSH or some other component, and so now we had to roll out a fix or get a fix from somewhere else. So I think that's probably the easiest way to see where the dividing between software and hardware is. But I agree with the other thing that Colin said is there's no going back. We're starting to take, in the IT world, we're starting to take devices that were historically hardware, and we're definitely defining software there. So you'll hear all sorts of terms like software-defined networking, software-defined wide area networking. It's all about not waiting for a new edition of hardware to come out to be able to use some new features or functionality. But like Alex said, and I think Karel kind of alluded to it in his earlier discussion, you get a lot of flexibility for that, but troubleshooting goes up a little bit and complexity goes up a little bit.
So speaking of complexity, if anyone who's watching can tell me how to zoom back in on my camera, that would be great, because I've been looking and I haven't figured it out. And I consider myself a Zoom expert, but I don't see an option to zoom my camera in. I've used the Microsoft's camera software. We're here to learn from each other, and I'm more than happy
I personally like to use the analog approach, so I have a very sensible zoom lens that I can just
yeah, see, there you go.
I prefer hardware. I'm just saying on that poll.
What are you using, Robert?
It's just a webcam. And it was fine at the start, and then someone came in with a noisy chair, and the camera got scared and just got kicked off.
So it's a digital zoom? What is it, a Brio or something?
Yeah, it's a digital zoom. I don't know. It's one of those knockoffs that when there was nothing else to be had on YouTube, on Amazon, that's all that was available. So sometimes you get what you get.
Squeak, squeak. Hold on.
I'm getting him some WD-40, people. We can get some WD-40.
Talking about that.
Hey, Thursday's my birthday.
He needs WD-80.
I'm still in the market for that Herman Miller Aeron chair, size C.
Okay.
You're getting more specific, man. It's almost like you're trying to throw hints.
I think GoFundMe might be appropriate.
That's right. Kickstarter.
So, pop quiz. Is this hardware or software?
That is a shell. You see, I'm not even going to answer. Yeah, so let somebody else answer, because I know exactly what that is.
This is a trick question.
Yes.
I plead the fifth.
Yeah.
Yes.
Well, you see, that's the problem. That's a good question. Was this hardware or software?
Good question. It's pretty much the same answer. So this has a little Italian processor in it. Probably heard of the Arduinos. Not quite as popular as the Raspberry Pis, but it's just an Arduino, right?
Depends on what you're doing. If you're
That's
talking
true.
about lower end engineering, then Arduino's ubiquitous.
Arduino's are the
Raspberry
kill,
Pi
yeah.
is going to be probably a more capable, but for the cost, the I/O, and what you're trying to do, the Arduino support community is a lot more available. So for engineering students, the Arduino is probably more ubiquitous, depending on, I mean, how it changes now. If you talk to EE people, probably not. They want something with a little bit more processing power, but your ME's looking just to get something running, Arduino's right there.
Yeah. Yeah. So this thing really, it's a computer.
That's it.
I mean, I've never had an Arduino crash on me because it's an extremely simple device, but it's a computer, and so is that ATEM.
Yeah.
Right. It's running a variant of Linux. Right, and a stripped down, very I wouldn't say low end, but reduced feature set processor.
It has fixed connectors. It has a surface you can actually push buttons on it, but the buttons are all digital. There's nothing physical for you to do on it. Even the console, now I don't have it here anymore, but even the Blackmagic console, it looks substantial. It's a huge desk, but when you pick it up, you realize this thing is really light because you have a T-bar, you have about 20 buttons, but everything else is computer control. So my issue with software has always been it's much harder to troubleshoot. It's much harder to troubleshoot a software problem. And I should know because I was an actual software engineer who worked with developers trying to find the bugs in their software. That's what I did for about 3 years, trying to find bugs in the software. And I found bugs, and I would have to visit like 5 different people to try to get an answer to the error messages that we got because of the bugs. With hardware, it either works or it doesn't.
Yeah.
But having said that, if it has enough software, you can work around hardware that's failing, right? So if you have a port that's bad or 2 ports that are bad, and you can work around that, right? Then the software defined, the software backed product is good. If you have a device that someone else figures out how to add functionality to, and you're able to update that firmware or update that software, you can gain the value of that without losing it. The issue, the concern I always have in all of these discussions or in all of these scenarios is stability. The problem with software products is that because they can code it, they're willing to throw things out there. When you have to put out hardware that has to work in order for you to sell it at all, you tend to get it right. It tends to stay in the shop until it's been produced properly. But when it's like, oh, we'll fix that at version 1.2, 1.4, then people throw anything out, and then you get a laundry list. You get a deliverable with this laundry list of caveats. Oh, under these 3 circumstances, such and such will be the case. Here's the workaround for that. It's like all that writing y'all did, y'all could have just written the code properly, right? So that's the concern.
Andrew, do you think that's a cultural thing? Because I noticed early on, and this is my old school thinking, kind of the Sony broadcast stuff versus the upstarts like Blackmagic Design, where I think you have even before that, just looking at software in general, seems to be very much a cultural thing. Like in Asia, where a lot of our electronics come from, a lot of it was designed, a lot of the high-end stuff from Sony, Matsushita or Panasonic, Canon, Nikon, you name it, it's almost all coming from the same Asian country and produced by Asian countries around that country, right? They make mostly hardware, mostly good hardware. Most of the Asian software I've seen is very, very, very bad. Whereas I think there's a different mindset where in the United States that generates most of the really good software in the world, most of the most popular software in the world. I think there is more of a tinker attitude, break it and make it cooler type attitude, right? Keep tinkering until you get something you like. And I think that's almost antithetical to we're going to design this, we're going to make this hardware thing. It is a thing, it's going to stay that thing, and it's going to work right as designed forever. What do you think about that?
I would have to agree. And I would say that part of the reason I agree is I watched people in IT over the years, those that came from a background when hardware was more static, when PCs remained essentially the same way from a hardware perspective for 3 or 4 years at a time, and you didn't have like this plethora of innovation just rolling out back to back to back. They looked at hardware and software differently than folks that came into the Windows 95 timeframe. And it's just like, you know, you just throw some software at it, you code something, you script something, and if it doesn't work, you look up something online and you figure out something. And there are pros and cons to both sides. And it really boils down to what we were saying earlier. There's some flexibility, right? There's flexibility in the software defined approach, and there is more consistency on the hardware based side. That consistency can be bureaucratic when you look at it from the negative standpoint, or it can be, or, you know, and that flexibility can be kind of freewheeling and archaic and anarchist like, right? It's just wild, wild west. But I think that, yeah, those folks that you mentioned all started from a hardware perspective. That was their forte. They built things that were going to be those things. And all of this extra software and people making the extra tweaks has come up in newer generations, and they're not really in line with that. Their organizations are not built around that. They don't prioritize around that. Whereas some of the folks who may not have that kind of engineering prowess have focused on the software to be the differentiator, the software to be where they can move, and it gives them more flexibility because they can just switch gears in terms of what hardware they throw in there, right? You know, like Synology storage, those guys make products across a variety of hardware, and they still manage to sell because it's their software that glues everything together. You don't have to see those differences.
I blame the internet, honestly, because prior to the internet, prior to being able to download updates, people coded a lot better, because for you to get an update out to 100,000 people, you had to send out 100,000 disks.
Well,
so there was a bigger cost involved.
Well, so remember there was the BBS thing, and everyone didn't have access to that. But the whole bulletin board system, you know, that you get the 80s, you have the pre-internet with your ComCast, not Comcast,
CompuServe and
CompuServe, thank you. CompuServe, AOL, Prodigy,
which I came across. Prodigy addressed this the other day.
Don't leave out Apple with eWorld.
Yeah, right. So you had all of these folks that had those kinds of things. I agree with you on the timing, but it's not strictly the internet. And now he's disappeared. It's not strictly the internet that created that that kind of an issue. I think that it had a lot to do with all of the other developments around the same time, right? Because
what happens when you speak bad about the internet? I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Sorry, go ahead. My bad. I couldn't.
Nobody saw because that wasn't the screen we were on. Please.
I think that you know, Windows 3.1 comes out at that time as the internet is coming online, right? It's the early 1990s into Windows 95. You have Apple doing certain things in terms of where their OS is right around that same time, right? So it's the prevalence of computing, right? Because Colin, you said something earlier about essentially people not matching up the right technology for a situation, right? One of the drawbacks of software-defined whatever is that it lowers the bar to accessibility, and then anybody and his brother jumps in on it and feels that they're competent enough to use it. And at the same time, the vendors are targeting. They want to sell as many of these things as possible. So they're trying to make broad appeal. And you'll find that people are entering in these realms who don't really understand what the technology is supposed to be doing and how they really should be using it. And you find a lot of inappropriate use because it's possible. Right. So I think the convergence of all of those factors play into why we saw the software side of it come, and also processors. as processors get more powerful, AMD, Intel, Cyrix, and all these folks on that side, PowerPC, and all these other folks, general purpose computing, which is usually less expensive than the SoC, right? Or a defined chipset. It became easier to just throw out this general purpose computer, throw a common OS on it like Linux, because we're in that same time frame. BSD is out there and it's free. Linux is now out there and it's free. And you can throw this stuff together, and a lot of the cost and the licensing that would go to somebody else is out the picture. So all of those factors come in together in that same time frame, and the internet just made it easier.
So the question then is, does it matter? Does software versus hardware matter in this day and age?
You know, I have actually a concrete example, and I'm actively working with this client. I say client with hesitation because I'm doing quite a bit of volunteer work. But the short answer is yes. I'm finding that I saw, without being too specific, you really had a kind of a generational fight with the integration of various systems at a church, right? Where you had some younger people that wanted to use software, everything, right? You have all the bells and whistles. Then you had the older people that just wanted the system to be ready in time for service on Sabbath, right? And they're not necessarily mutually exclusive goals, but with the state of the art as it is, you kind of have to have a balance between the two, or have a system of either checklists or redundancies to make the whiz-bang system more reliable. And it's an actual tension. I think a tension between the two schools of thought. And instead, what you get are systems that don't really work well with each other, because even if one part of it was reliable, the other part isn't. And the bottom line is it's impacting worship. And that's where, you know, my concern comes in. You know, you could have any system, whether it be software defined, whether it be canon string, whether it be, firmware or solid state, carrier pigeon, what have you, right? Because I mean, the ultimate reliability, everyone sits, well, not today because of COVID, but everyone sits around the circle, right? Or you have a kind of a ecclesiastical type of church where you have the high roofs and marble, everything, hard surfaces. All you have to do is barely whisper and everyone in the church is going to hear you, because that's how it was designed. It didn't require sound reinforcement. Right, and you can pretty much see who's speaking, so you didn't need image magnification either, right? Mm-hmm. And the people you're generally trying to reach were walking in the door, so you weren't streaming anything to anybody or trying to shout out the window. But of course, we're in a different place today. We have larger houses of worship. We're trying to evangelize outside of the four walls of the building, trying to reach different and disparate audiences. But I think of all the fights and challenges out there, I don't really think technology should be one, but I see it because of the generational kind of infighting.
Well, one of the things from personal experience, I've had a harder time adjusting, which is very odd considering my background, to some of the more digital advances, such as taking an iPad to control your audio. Now, Carell, you do this on a regular basis, right? Yeah. I just haven't gotten used to the non-tactile. I don't want to have to scroll across 3 pages to get to my 64th input because the CD player went too loud. You know, CD player comes in, it's too loud. I've got to flip through pages and then bring it down slowly. Then you got to make sure your finger's just in the right spot because it's not coming down quickly enough. Then you do it too much and it goes. It's that type of thing where I lose the tactile feel. How have you adjusted?
You know, the thing for me is I think each little feature has its own place, right? So what do I mean by that? I personally at front of house would not mess with a iPad. I just wouldn't, right? Now that's at the front of house position, but in monitor world, I could get around with an iPad. Why? Because in that case, I'm able to then, as the technician, go up to the stage, make the adjustments, and talk with the musicians right there and then, and make the change, right? I still like at front of house having the faders to grab so that I at least know what I'm dealing with, right? I would say same thing kind of when I'm dealing with recordings, but I think I can also get away with using a interface just, you know, to kind of arm tracks or this or that or whatever to do stuff if I'm just trying to record arm things and then record, right? So I think it comes down to the application. And so what you're seeing a lot of people doing is making kind of a hybrid situation or scenario depending on what the application is. And that's what you're finding, you know. So some folks may use like some kind of a device to plug all their cameras into, but then they didn't go buy the highfalutin, you know, switcher. They just get a little controller and program it a little bit, and it controls the functions and does all the stuff they need to do. All right. So you're not having to go get the hardware to do it, but you're kind of using the blending of one system and another to kind of make it happen. However, let me say that with a caveat, right? You have to know what you're doing, because if you don't, you're gonna mess yourself up very bad. Okay, and that's the thing. So what works well with this and this and this? You gotta comprehensively put the system together, right? And I know several friends of mine that are AV technicians that do consultations. They kind of get frustrated sometimes when they go in. I'm just going to say it. They'll go in and do a consultation for a church, and the church kind of says, thank you for the consultation. Yeah, thank you for the parts list. We're going to build the system out on our own on a cheaper dime.
Yep.
And then the system never works the way it was intended. And then they blame the AV contractor for their bad
choosing the wrong parts. Yep.
Right. So it really has to be a comprehensive piece, but also it depends on the task that you're trying to do.
Good, very good answer, actually. I will say one of the things that people don't factor in is time. While physically, one of the things you mentioned earlier is like running a snake. When you're setting up a show, running a snake is tedious. Snakes are heavy. You got to drag it from the car. Colin, you've done enough shows to know a snake. First of all, you can't put it in anything. The case to carry it in is huge. Then it's unwielding, just unwinding it. You got to make sure it's laid flat. A snake is very difficult. It's so much easier to take that one Ethernet cable, run it to the front of the house, run it to your console. You want redundancy? Oh.
I'm just saying. I'm just saying.
Two Ethernet cable, which is true because it's this tiny little cable. It's easy to run two of them. But then all that time is spent doing the routing. And as you said, Corel, if you get the routing wrong, your show is over.
That sounds familiar.
All because of one button. All because one button wasn't done properly. We spent hours. This is from experience. We spent hours trying to get that that Midas console to work properly because one button wasn't switched properly.
Yep. Yeah.
So one of the things you have to take into account is between software and hardware is the time. The time may be the same. It's just spent in different places.
Right.
Okay. So I did show you the Stream Deck. This is the XL. Okay. So I've done now maybe 10 different shows using this. The first time I set it up, it took 5 hours. 5 hours. Whereas the ATEM console I took out, the first time I set it up took 30 minutes.
Now, that's really not fair. They're two completely different things, right?
Right. Right. This is basically macros. And I know when I set up macros on the ATEM, it did take longer. So
now, My Stream Deck is still in the box, so I'll defer to your expertise.
I mean, if you want to donate it, we can. I can figure out how to get some baselines to see how long it takes me to get running. I will volunteer as tribute.
Hey, tell people what it is, Robert, and I really don't know, because I thought it was just a keyboard with, you could modify the pretty little LED button things. Is there actually an engine or a computer in there that you can tell it what key sequence to, or what commands to send out?
Yes and no. So I've experienced it with Wirecast and Vmix. Wirecast is actually easier to do. It takes much less time to set up Wirecast. The problem is there's less functionality in Wirecast. So with Wirecast, you do most of the programming using the Stream Deck software. With Vmix, you do most of the programming using the Vmix software. So in that case, the Stream Deck, you just tell it which buttons are live. Mm-hmm. And then Vmix, you have to go in and program each push. It is so powerful. You can have a different option when you push it down than when you let it go. So Vmix, it is so incredibly powerful.
So describe a little bit of what you would use it to do.
Okay, so right now it runs the show. So I go into Vmix and I say, this input is me. This input is Corral. This input is Colin. Now you guys can't see the switching, unfortunately. And then this button is everybody. And that just means it goes to different inputs. So it'll pull up a different input. But I could also have it stop and start recording. I can have it put up lower thirds. I can have it sing and dance if I want, literally. I can have doves come flying in the screen if I so program it. It's just that that's time consuming. So as where you would set up a macro on the ATEM to do the same, and you'd have to hit record, do all the button presses you want to do, and you're done. It's the exact same thing. You press a button, then you say what this button does. You can say what color the button will be. You can say if the button has a picture or not. It is incredible. I wish you guys can see it, but I can actually have your faces. Oh, you can't. Your faces are in each button.
Okay.
Oh, really?
Yeah. Because Vmix will send thumbnails back to it. Now, there are a couple of different devices. Cool. Yeah, like the X keys is a less robust version of this. But you will spend time setting it up. The thing is, you set it up once.
So I guess my question is it really a USB keyboard with some pretty graphics on it? Like, if you press the same button in the top left, does the same binary or hexadecimal, whatever, come out of that as a result from that button press and that button release every time? And there's some kind of companion program on a PC that translates it and says what that button press is. Yeah. Yes. Am I making any sense? Yeah. I don't know.
Yeah. The thing with Vmix is, and with Wirecast, is you can program the keyboard to do the same thing. So a button press will give you a particular action. The difference is you have to remember what that button is. Here I can program words, I can program symbols, I can program whatever I want to help me remember. So that's the big difference. That's why a keyboard may have as many keys, but it is nowhere near as useful.
Okay.
So in that sense, software has made hardware so much better. Just absolutely phenomenally better, because I can have multiple pages. I think I can get about 96 button presses out of this, and I may be undershooting it just a bit. So as much as I love to say I'm a hardware guy, you're right. There's no going back. It's all the same now.
Other than you get the satisfaction of pressing a button and hearing that tactile feedback,
yeah,
the haptic response.
I mean, now that response comes from clicking on a mouse and making the command.
Right.
Because I mean, just to Robert's point, looking at it from the audio side, if we're looking at, say, a Dante network now, right? And you have all your stuff patched together and you see each device on this spreadsheet that you got there, right? Each device now, you just can click where you want it, or you can select across a whole row of them and it does the whole routing, and I didn't have to lift a finger other than to hit the mouse. And so that makes life a whole lot easier when you're trying to go and do shows between venues very quickly, right? Or you've got to go from one truck to the other and make this routing. I mean, I'm thinking about something that I'm working on for interpretation systems that we're doing with radios, right? It's Dante based with the interpreter stations that we have.
Oh, that's awesome.
They're using, right?
Yeah.
So, you know, it's made life a lot easier in terms of how I get signal from point A to point B, how I can route it from what the interpreter's doing to alternate feeds that the truck has to do to get different languages, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, there's so many different applications that you can look at this and be like, wow, software is making my life easier. And it definitely is. And I don't think audio is ever going to go back. You know, I come from a traditional studio background, you know, where analog is still kind of the king.
Mm-hmm.
If you're looking at a desk now, even if it is analog, like one of the ones I'm looking at, you know, possibly to get for here in my spot, you know, it's got two sides to it. It's got the analog summing and stuff that you can run things through it, but at the same token, you hit a button, boom, and then it's controlling your DAW,
Mm-hmm.
right? And so the faders become the faders that you would have in your DAW.
Yeah.
So, you know, it's not gonna go away. It's gonna continue, I think, to feed into some of the things we do. And really, again, it comes down to the application of how you need to use stuff. Really is really where it ends, right? So I know for us studio guys, a lot of us like using analog hardware because we like the sound of it. That probably will never go away. But in terms of how I'm recording things, I'm not running around with a radar system.
Well,
or you know, an ADAT, you know, the Alesis, you know, unit.
Well, just the way the digital cameras eventually took over. They didn't take over when everyone thought they would. We just felt that analog cameras were going to last. It was just never going to happen. But they finally got to a place where there are far more people using digital than analog on the camera side of the house. We're going to see that. You're going to get to the place where it's going to be not discernible, right? It's going to be too hard to discern between the audio quality and or video quality of a digital system, or primarily digital system versus a primarily analog system, sorry.
Yeah, but my problem with software is this exact problem that's facing me right now. Because physically, as Alex mentioned, I should have just been able to reach up, adjust the dial, and I've fixed it.
Yeah.
I've spent the last 40 minutes. See,
so much better.
I've spent it. See, but his is digital. He doesn't count. He doesn't count.
But here's the thing, Robert. We're kind of in the wild west of software defined everything. There's the convergence and everyone's throwing stuff in and there are features coming out every day and you're gonna kind of have to stay on top of it because people change things and you go to the UI and you're like, what do they do between versions?
Oh,
okay.
Yeah.
But that's going to stabilize. That has to stabilize because as people once you get enough investment, right? Once you get enough investment in your product, you can't afford to annoy your installed base too much. And so you're going to see that settle down and you're going to see security vulnerabilities be the next thing. People who can minimize that will stay in business longer, and people who can make the UI more sophisticated and more steady, right? This is why Apple has been dominant on the mobile front, because they give a very consistent experience across generations of hardware, and they don't tend to have as many hideous vulnerabilities as, say, the Android side of the house. So that's where it's going to go. Once everybody's gotten in and gotten you with their gee whiz, wowzer kind of a showy stuff, it's going to come down to stability again, and it's going to come down to consistency again, and people will differentiate by that.
all right. Well, gentlemen, your hour has passed. I thank you all for joining us late. But
better late than never.
That's true. That's true. And thank you all, because it's made the conversation so much better. And there's a lot of sides to the story. So I think there's a consensus that in essence, it doesn't matter how we feel about hardware because you're going to have to deal with what's available. Like I said, I was a hardcore hardware guy. I was ready to drop a lot of money on a hardware solution. But once I discovered a software solution that was stable and consistent and dependable, that cost far less, that's what I decided to go with. And I haven't been disappointed. So
I think we'll have crossed over into the promised land when you see a software-defined camera and people willing to use it.
Wow, that's a good point.
Now, that depends on what class of camera you're talking about.
It starts low and moves up, right?
We do have software-defined cameras. They're called cell phones.
well.
But the truth is, when movie cameras become software-defined, then
cinema cameras, DSLRs.
Yeah.
I'm a big Apple fan, so I feel like I get to knock them. My super expensive iPhone 11 Max crashes on the regular because of all the apps on it.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. It's simply running out of memory. Right. It's hitting that wall and it's resetting. I don't want my camera to reset when I'm being paid to capture someone on camera.
Yeah, that would go poorly very quickly.
I will say one thing. I think there is a lot you can do with software, but I think the benefit comes with the hardware you're putting it on, even if it's going to be a hybrid situation. Ultimately, if you don't have the hardware reliability, your software doesn't mean anything. If your caps swell and they fail, or things light on fire, or they overheat, it doesn't matter. I mean, speaking at it from the mechanical side, I have a background in mechanical engineering. Like, to be completely blunt, your software can be great, but if your hardware that you're running it on is not reliable, then it doesn't matter. So I think the end of it for me for this discussion is the software will make the hardware better as long as the hardware is designed in such a way to support the flexibility that they're trying to get. There's a reason why the Blackmagic A10 Mini could not provide the same features that the Pro could. I'm sure there's a hardware reason. I'm sure there were some places where when they could add features, they did add features because it was just a matter of changing software. I think I think there's this argument to be made, at least from my side of it, in an academic sense, that you have to make the investment to be able to figure out where you can make your hardware solution provide you some level of latitude to expand. And ultimately, you have to design that way. There's going to be a trade-off. There's going to be a price point. There's going to be a premium you pay for it. But I think that's the other side of it. But when it comes down to use cases, I think you ultimately have to defer to the experience of your operator who's going to be running it. Because I don't care, you could have a genius program it and it can be amazing. But if you have an uninformed operator, how much value do you get out of that system? If one person can fix that system, you have a one point of failure system. If that person isn't available for whatever reason, and I think that's something that people ultimately have to consider. When it comes to software versus hardware, I think you ultimately have to consider the end user in the loop and what it's going to take to get that running well. And I think the case for getting solid hardware is still there. I think there are times when people want to cheap out, but you need to know when to cheap out and when you can cheap out, because, if the air traffic control system was pure software, I mean, it may not matter now because not many flights are going out, but I'm going to tell you right now, I have firsthand experience. That system is hardware backed. I'm talking separate power grids. I'm talking about second and third redundancies. When it comes to certain things, it's a marriage of the two. And I think this whole discussion has to be put in the context of you have to understand where your trade-offs are. And I think the only way you get that is by talking to someone who has a keen knowledge and can appreciate the nuances. And that's why you have to go to the AV professionals that have spent the time and have the experience digging up these types of things, because there are going to be some gotchas, and you can at least mitigate your risk by bringing someone who's been there, seen it, done it. And that's just my 2 cents.
That is a very good point. And I guess we will close on that point. Thank you, gentlemen. Really appreciate you joining us today. And we can schedule what, every 2 weeks? We're going to go every 2 weeks?
You're just trying to get this on video so we can't back out of it, right?
Exactly.
I know he is.
So thanks again. We got to talk about what our next discussion will be. I think we're going to end up getting into discussion about pay to play. And that's going to be between personnel and software. How much are you willing to pay for these things? So thank you all very much. We don't have a closing. Wait, we do have closing music. Let me get that ready. You all guys have anything you want to say when you close out? Anything special? Happy birthday, Colin.
Oh, happy birthday.
Let's hope
Size
somebody
C.
gets you that chair you want.
Size C.
Size C. We'll remember that.
Yeah.
All right. Despite my bad camera. Oh, there's something else. Yes, sir.
I was gonna say my tongue-in-cheek answer from earlier. Never
All
really
right.
got around to it, right? So
Ah.
my answer to your question, yes.
And on that, we say good night.